Beginning in the mid-18th century, a claim originally made by antiquarian Henry Bourne began to echo in certain academic circles. That elements of early Christian tradition, including feast days such as Christmas and Easter, are little more than pagan customs repurposed and renamed. While this assertion has endured, being often presented as historical fact in books, documentaries, and online discussions, when diligently examined, it simply does not arise from solid historical evidence. Instead, it represents a way of doing history that was part of an academic movement whose assumptions, methods, and conclusions are long regarded as obsolete. The movement reached its peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries within what scholars called the history of religions school of thought. This approach attempted to explain all religions as variations of a single human phenomenon, evolving over time through borrowing, adaptation, and reinterpretation. While quite influential in its day, this framework was shaped less by archaeological discovery and more by philosophical presuppositions. At the center of this theory lies a critical assumption that God does not and cannot exist. From this premise, religion is understood exclusively as an ancient human invention. Consequently, every religious belief, symbol, and practice must have originated earlier in a more primitive form, which was recycled repeatedly across cultures and centuries. Within this framework, similarities between religions are not treated as coincidences or independent developments. Instead, resemblance itself is taken as proof of borrowing. If two traditions share similar elements, such as dates or symbols, the later tradition is assumed to have copied the earlier one. Central to this school of thought is a basic logical error, the assumption that correlation equals causation. In other words, if two customs resemble one another, one must have caused the other. Modern historians recognize this as a fallacy, not a principle of sound reasoning. Yet, especially in popular-level evaluations of Christian traditions, this fallacy is frequently advanced as proof of borrowing. Dates that fall near solstices or equinoxes are assumed to be pagan in origin. Comparable symbols that appear in multiple cultures are assumed to have been imported. The available historical evidence is simply ignored in favor of perceived surface-level resemblance. The real problem comes when Christians themselves begin to accept and even promote this flawed and outdated way of reasoning. It can create a kind of cognitive dissonance, accepting a flawed method to explain certain aspects of Christian tradition while rejecting it when it challenges core doctrines. A coherent intellectual framework cannot operate on selectively applied logic. Christianity, after all, affirms that God does exist, that he acts in history, and that divine revelation is indeed possible. As such, aesthetic similarities between revealed truth and anything that may have come before must obviously be purely coincidental. A Christian must always hold this line of reasoning unless and until positive proof of borrowing is presented. No respectable Christian, after all, would think it appropriate to accuse Moses of paganism because of the common elements shared by ancient Judaism and the pagan religions that came before it. After all of them offered sacrifices, incense, or offerings of various similar items, all had their prophets and priests, all used special vestments, rituals, altars, and temples. Yet, unless evidence to the contrary is presented, a Christian is to assume that these similarities are irrelevant, given the clear record of divine instruction. Now, let's suppose that a certain brother, let's call him Tim, is a good Western evangelically minded Christian. He correctly believes, based on all the clear evidence in Scripture, that the basic Christian faith is divinely revealed, despite any supposed similarities to any pagan religion that preceded it. He correctly assumes that correlation does not equal causation, and that similarities can and do occur across completely disconnected cultures simply because people tend to respond in similar ways to shared human experiences. He knows that all cultures deal, in similar ways, with changing seasons, sunrise and sunset, birth, death, and communal meals, to name a few things. It is therefore inevitable that similarities will arise naturally, even between cultures that have no contact whatsoever. Brother Tim knows that these similarities are best explained as unrelated parallel developments rather than historical dependence. Now, suppose that Brother Tim adheres to a special theological school of thought, one that promotes a specific interpretation of the Book of Revelation. Suppose that his interpretation rests on designating a certain group of Christians in history as promoters of pagan practices. He then proceeds to examine their presupposed practices in order to identify outward similarities to pagan customs or symbols. Before long, he may find that indeed some similarities may exist. Tim is then happy to make YouTube videos citing these similarities in support of his preferred theological interpretation, and thus, without even realizing it, poor Brother Tim has just undermined the validity of his own Christian faith, out of sheer devotion to a secondary theological consideration. In his zeal to promote a theological point of marginal importance, he adopted fallacious methodology that can, in turn, be used to undermine the more essential aspects of his very faith. Fortunately, historians today rely on a far more rigorous and ethical approach to study the origins of religious traditions. Rather than starting with an assumption, they trace customs backward in time, step by step, until the evidence disappears. They examine extant documents, inscriptions, artifacts, and first-hand accounts to understand how a practice was actually understood by those who observed it. This method does not presume borrowing. It does not infer influence without proof. Instead, it allows the historical record to speak for itself. When evidence exists, conclusions can be drawn. When it does not, responsible historians refrain from outlandish speculation. The rejection of the idea that correlation equals causation is not ideological, it is practical. When this fallacy is applied consistently, it produces absurd conclusions. It would imply that all legal systems share a single origin, that all writing systems are borrowed from one another, or that all architecture descends from one ancient civilization. In religious history, this method leads to predictable distortions. Pagan sources are interpreted generously, Christian sources skeptically. Silence is treated as proof. Chronology is bent to fit preconceived conclusions. The result is not history, but confirmation bias disguised as scholarship. When the proper historical method is applied, the sweeping claims about pagan origins quickly lose their force. Without direct evidence of borrowing, without documents, testimony, or artifacts demonstrating intentional adoption, the claims collapse under their own weight. The question concerning the origins of Christian feast days, then, cannot be answered by superficial comparisons or ideological assumptions. It must be approached through careful historical analysis, grounded in archaeology, documentation, and consistent reasoning. Anything less risks substituting myth for history, as so many authors notoriously did in the 19th century. In future videos, we look forward to applying this method carefully and precisely. Rather than repeating inherited assumptions or popular modern myths, to examine the evidence itself, case by case, to see what the historical record actually reveals about the origins of Christian feast days. And that is the end of this video. Thanks for watching.